Welcome to Thoughts on Ministry podcast with Ray Eppard, a podcast focused on helping you be more effective as you serve God. Now, here's your host, Ray Eppard.
Hello, glad you could join us today. I'm Ray Eppard, and this is my Thoughts on Ministry. We're talking about leadership, particularly gaps, identifying gaps, targeting gaps, and closing the gap. Gaps are those areas in your ministry, your business, your life, that the way things are and the way things should be are different. And we want to identify those gaps. We want to prioritize those gaps, target a gap in there that we're going to work on, and then we're going to work at closing that gap. We're going to put energy and effort into it. Last time we talked about how that businesses sometimes they want to have, they're in the customer service business, but yet sometimes that's not what everyone experiences actually when you're in the store. And so those gaps need to be identified, and then resources need to be put into that gap to close that gap. When it comes to personally, there's things, I know a couple years ago I was praying, because every year toward the end of the year, I pray and I ask the Lord, what is it that I need to do for next year? Not just the assignment, what are the things we're supposed to make happen, but what is it I need to change about me? And I started to say it was really funny, but a lot of other people think it's funny, but it wasn't funny being on the receiving end of it. Basically, one time the Lord told me, He said, well, I told you a couple years ago to work on something, and He said you haven't done it, so that you might as well go ahead and work on that since you haven't done it so far. Well, what He was identifying was that there was a gap there. I had identified it. He had identified it for me, and if you would, in a manner of speaking, I went, yes, I got to make that a priority. But I never actually set into closing the gap. I never actually mobilized my efforts. I never pulled my energy into it and said, I'm going to do this, and here's my plan, and this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to close that. And matter of fact, during that time of prayer, I told the Lord some of the reasons why I hadn't done that. And it came down to, well, I really don't understand this subject. And so at that point, He began to show me some things that helped me see it differently. Because I had actually read some books. I had tried to study some things on it, but none of it just really set right. And so that discouraged me in my efforts. But here it was, God told me to do something. I did put some effort and energy into it, but when it didn't work out too well, I quit. I'm sure none of you can identify with that. But what I should have done at that point was go, God, what is the deal here? See, He could have told me that 2 years before, but I never continued the effort and the energy. I cut it off. I stopped. I didn't continue to put energy into it. That's why no progress had been made. That was with me personally. Same thing within a ministry or within a business. Once you identify the gap and you target that gap, then you have to put the effort, you have to put the energy, you have to put the resources in it. You have to be determined that you're going to close the gap, because otherwise difficulties will come up. Closing that gap's not always going to be the easiest thing in the world. You're not going to be able to just say, hey, we're going to close that gap, and boom, 30 days later, the gap's closed. That's not how it works. There's a reason that there's a gap there. The reason that the gap's there can be a number of things. It can be largely that people don't want to do what's necessary for that gap to close, as was in my case. It can be that there's things that are discouragement. There can actually be practical things that are in a way. You have to figure out what it is that is hindering the closing of that gap. But you have to be determined that you're going to close it. You're not just going to put resources in it for a while. You're not just going to put energy into it for a while, but you're going to close that gap. You're going to get that gap to the place that it is not your greatest vulnerability anymore. You might not get it to where it is completely closed, because there might be other things that at that point they become a greater priority to you because of where you are than that minuscule difference. But you have to be determined that gap is closing. We're not going to leave that difference there. We're going to stay engaged with this until it closes. The gap must close. It can be done. Doesn't mean you have to be mean or hard or anything like that, but you do have to be determined. And sometimes people can take that as mean and hard. But close the gap. Identify the gap, target the gap, close the gap. That will help you move forward in what God has for you. Thanks for joining us again. I'm Ray Eppert, and that's my thoughts on ministry.
You've been listening to Thoughts on Ministry with Ray Eppert. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter.